This is my true story. I gave everything to raise my daughter after my husband died. I thought she would stand by me when I grew old, but when I asked her for help, she looked at me with cold eyes and said, "I'm not your caretaker. I have my own life." Those words broke me more than any illness ever could. I sat alone in the house I built for her, abandoned and forgotten. But what she didn't know was that I had kept a secret for decades, one that would shatter her world forever. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. When my husband died, I was left alone with a child in my arms and a world that suddenly felt too heavy for one woman to carry. I was young then, but grief had already aged me beyond my years. My daughter was small, innocent, and she looked at me with eyes that carried both fear and hope. In that moment, I promised myself that no matter how hard life became, I would never let her feel abandoned. I would give her everything, even if it meant breaking myself in the process, and so began a lifetime of sacrifice. I worked wherever I could find work. In the mornings, I cleaned houses for people who barely knew my name. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached, washed windows until my arms burned, and carried loads of laundry heavier than my own body could bear. At night, when other families sat together at dinner tables, I sat under dim lamps, sewing clothes for neighbors, mending torn dresses, and stitching worn shirts for a few coins. Every penny mattered. I saved every cent I could, often skipping meals so that my daughter would never have to go to bed hungry. There were days when I was so tired I could barely stand, but I forced myself to keep moving because I knew a child was depending on me. My hands cracked from harsh cleaning soaps, my back bent from endless bending and lifting, my eyes strained from hours of sewing by candlelight. Still, I never complained. My body could break, but my daughter's future had to remain whole. I told myself that the hunger in my stomach, the bruises on my skin, and the exhaustion in my bones would all be worth it if she could grow up with opportunities I never had. As she grew older, I made sure she never saw how much I struggled. I wanted her to see strength, not weakness. I wanted her to believe she was loved even when the world was cruel to me. I walked miles in the rain to buy her books for school. I pawned my few pieces of jewelry to pay for her school uniforms. I took on extra work during the holidays just so I could afford to put a little gift under the tree, even if it meant I went without. Everything I did, every step I took, was for her. When she became a young woman, I supported her dreams without hesitation. She wanted education, and I found a way to pay for it, even if it meant taking loans I could not afford. She wanted to get married, and I gave her my blessing, even when my heart ached at the thought of losing her. I worked harder to save money for her wedding, scraping together every resource so she could walk down the aisle with dignity. I stayed up nights stitching her dress by hand because I could not afford the expensive gowns in shops, but I wanted her to feel like a princess. When the day came, I sat in the corner of the church, my hands folded, tears in my eyes, not of sorrow, but of pride. I thought, in that moment, that all the years of sacrifice had been worth it. After her marriage, I still gave what I could. When she needed help with rent, I gave her money. When her children were born, I helped care for them so she could rest. I cooked meals, washed dishes, folded laundry, and rocked babies to sleep long after my body no longer had the strength for such tasks. Every time she looked tired, I told myself, this is why I worked all those years, to be here when she needs me. I thought she saw me as her foundation, her rock, her safe place. I believed, with all my heart, that one day when I grew old and weak, she would return that care to me. I thought she would remember the nights I went hungry so she could eat, the years I wore the same old coat so she could wear new clothes to school, the mornings I kissed her forehead before leaving for work, even though I could barely stand on my own 2 feet. I thought she would see all of that and feel gratitude, love, and responsibility to stand by me in my old age. But I was wrong. The sacrifices that defined my entire life seemed invisible to her. The nights of labor, the hunger, the tears, I carried them so she could walk freely. And yet, as I grew older, I began to see something in her eyes that chilled me. Not gratitude, not love, but annoyance. To her, I was no longer a mother who had built her life with my blood and sweat. I was beginning to look like a burden, someone taking up space, someone who no longer mattered. Still, I held on to hope, because I had given her my everything, and surely, I told myself, surely that must mean something. Surely she would not forget her mother's lifetime of sacrifice. The change did not happen overnight. At first it was subtle, so small I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. My daughter still spoke to me, still allowed me in her home, but there was a sharpness in her tone I had never heard before. It was in the way she sighed when I asked for a glass of water. It was in the way her eyes rolled when I forgot where I placed something. Little things, but they cut deeply, because I remembered when those same eyes used to look at me with love and respect. I brushed it aside, telling myself she was tired, stressed, busy with her own family. But deep inside, I felt the first sting of distance, the first shadow of coldness creeping into the bond I thought was unbreakable. As time passed, the signs grew harder to ignore. She began to complain about small things I needed. When I asked if she could pick up my medicine from the pharmacy, she snapped that it was too much trouble. When I asked if I could stay for dinner, she muttered about how food isn't free. I sat at her table, eating small portions, swallowing both my meal and my humiliation in silence. I remembered the countless nights I had gone without food so she could eat more. I remembered walking in the cold to buy her bread, even when I could not afford shoes for myself. And now, hearing her complain about the cost of a simple plate of food, I felt the cracks in my heart deepen. She started speaking of me not as her mother, but as if I was an expense, an obligation she wished she could avoid. When neighbors visited, she acted polite, smiling, calling me mom, with fake sweetness. But when the door closed, her tone shifted like the snap of a twig. Her words grew shorter, colder, dripping with annoyance. You're always needing something. You slow me down. I can't live my life if I'm stuck taking care of you. I heard those words over and over, each one carving deeper into me like a knife. I tried to ignore them, but they echoed in my mind when I lay awake at night. The worst part was how she treated me in front of her children, my grandchildren. She spoke about me as if I were a nuisance, a problem they would one day inherit. When I dropped a plate, she sighed loudly and said, "See? This is why I can't handle her anymore." The little ones watched, their eyes wide, learning from her tone that their grandmother was not someone to respect, but someone to tolerate. That realization crushed me more than anything else. I had dreamed of being the kind of grandmother who filled her grandchildren's lives with warmth and love. But instead, I was being painted as a burden right in front of their innocent eyes. Still, I kept quiet. I told myself that love means patience, and maybe if I stayed silent, if I endured her words, she would remember. I clung to the hope that the child I had carried, the girl I had raised, still lived somewhere inside her. I wanted to believe that the warmth she once had was only buried beneath the stress of adulthood, and that one day it would return. But with every passing month, her coldness grew sharper, her distance wider. She began to avoid me, leaving me alone for longer stretches of time. When I called, she let the phone ring without answering. When I knocked on her door, she opened it with irritation etched across her face. I felt like a stranger in her life, unwelcome in the very world I had worked so hard to give her. I stopped asking for much, stopped trying to share stories, stopped trying to remind her of the bond we once had. Every time I spoke, her response reminded me that she saw me not as a blessing, but as a weight dragging her down. At night, I sat alone in the small corner of her house she allowed me, staring at my hands. These were the same hands that had once held her as a baby, that had cooked her meals, washed her clothes, wiped away her tears. These hands had built her life, but now she looked at them as if they were useless, as if they no longer had value. I stared at the lines and wrinkles, the scars from years of labor, and for the first time in my life, I began to feel invisible to the person who should have seen me most clearly. The first signs of coldness were like whispers at first, easy to ignore, but soon they grew into shouts that I could no longer silence in my mind. I realized then that something had shifted forever between us. The daughter I had sacrificed everything for was slipping away from me, not because death had taken her, but because pride and selfishness had replaced the love that once bound us. And though I still hoped for her heart to soften, a part of me knew I was beginning to lose her to a coldness that might never thaw. The day of rejection is burned into my memory like fire against skin. It was not a fight, not a loud argument with doors slammed or voices raised. It was worse than that. It was cold, sharp, final, spoken with a cruelty that pierced deeper than any blade. My health had begun to decline. I was weaker than I used to be, my body moving slower, my strength fading. I could no longer sweep the floors as quickly or climb the stairs without stopping to catch my breath. Simple tasks left me breathless. I hated to admit it, but I needed help. And in my heart, I believed that asking my daughter, the very child I had poured my life into, would be natural. Who else would care for me if not her? That morning, I gathered the courage to speak. My voice was soft, almost embarrassed, as I asked her if she could help me more. Maybe drive me to the doctor, sit with me during meals, or just keep me company in the evenings. I wasn't asking for riches, not for anything grand. Just a little care, just a little love. I thought she would see my fragility, remember my sacrifices, and step forward with compassion. But instead, she turned to me with eyes colder than winter itself. Her words fell like stones. "I'm not your caretaker. I have my own life." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room spun, my heart stopped, and I felt like the world had shifted beneath my feet. I thought I must have misheard, that perhaps stress or anger had twisted her words. But no. She repeated them again, sharper this time, her face tight with annoyance. "I can't spend my life looking after you. You're not my responsibility." I sat frozen in the chair, my body trembling as if I had been struck. My own daughter, the child I had worked for, suffered for, lived for, was rejecting me, not just my request for help, but my very place in her life. I wanted to remind her of everything I had given. The nights I walked miles in the rain to fetch her medicine when she was sick. The years I sewed clothes late into the night so she could have school uniforms. The meals I skipped so she would have food on her plate. I wanted to scream those memories into her heart, to make her see the truth she was denying. But I couldn't. My throat closed, my voice silenced by the sheer weight of her words. Instead, I sat there quietly, tears blurring my vision, my heart breaking in slow, merciless beats. The humiliation was unbearable. I was still in the house I had worked to build, the roof I had sacrificed for, and yet I felt like an intruder, an unwanted guest. She walked away from me, her back straight, her head held high, as if she had won some kind of battle. But I knew the truth. She had not won anything. She had only lost the last fragments of my trust, of my belief that she still carried love for me in her heart. That night, I lay awake in my bed, the words replaying in my mind over and over. "I'm not your caretaker. I have my own life." The cruelty wasn't only in the words themselves, but in the meaning behind them. She wasn't just saying she couldn't help me. She was declaring that my life no longer mattered to her, that I was no longer part of the future she envisioned for herself. I was being erased, not by death, but by neglect, by rejection from the very person I had lived for. The loneliness that followed was heavier than anything I had carried before. I had been poor, I had been hungry, I had been broken by labor, but I had never felt this kind of emptiness. To know that your own child sees you not as a blessing, but as a burden, it kills something inside you that can never be revived. I sat alone at the table the next day, staring at my trembling hands, remembering how those hands once cradled her as a baby. They had been enough then. Why were they not enough now? I wanted to believe her words were spoken in a moment of anger, that she would come back later with an apology, with tears, with a soft embrace. But days passed, and the silence grew heavier. No apology came. No gesture of love appeared. She had spoken the truth of her heart, and now she carried on as if I were simply an extra piece of furniture in her home, unnecessary, unwanted, in the way. The rejection broke me in ways I still cannot describe. It wasn't just that she refused to care for me. It was that she erased the very foundation of who I was to her. I was her mother, and in one sentence, she stripped that word of its meaning. She did not see me as the woman who gave her life, who built her world. She saw me only as an obstacle in her path, something to be discarded. And as I sat there, abandoned in the very house I had built with my own hands, I realized something I had tried to deny for too long. My daughter no longer saw my worth. After her words, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a cage, each wall pressing down on me with memories of sacrifice and love that had been thrown back in my face. I sat alone at the wooden table where I once served meals, where laughter used to fill the air, where my daughter once clung to my arm asking for stories before bed. Now, that same table was silent. My plate sat untouched, the food cold, my heart colder. I stared at the empty chair across from me, remembering how many times I had sat there watching her eat while I went hungry. The echo of those days filled me with pain so sharp that it almost felt physical. I tried to hold myself together during the day, moving slowly through the house, folding laundry, wiping down surfaces, trying to keep busy so I would not collapse under the weight of my sorrow. But no matter what I did, the silence was too loud. My daughter's footsteps no longer came near me unless they were heavy with annoyance. Her voice reached me only when she had something cold to say. The space between us was wide, yet we lived under the same roof. That distance broke me more than living miles apart ever could. At night, I lay in bed, the ceiling above me blurry with tears I could not stop. I thought of the years I had given away, the youth I had burned like fuel so she could have warmth. I thought of the nights I walked home alone from work with aching legs, of the coins I counted over and over to make sure there would be enough for her school books. I thought of the times I patched her shoes so her feet would never touch the dirt, while my own soles wore thin. And now, here I was, old and fragile, my heart begging for kindness, and the only response I received was rejection. The pain of that realization hollowed me. I had built my life around one belief, that love given would one day return, that sacrifices made in silence would be remembered in gratitude. But as I sat alone at the table, my hands trembling over cold tea, I understood the truth. Sometimes love does not return. Sometimes sacrifice is forgotten. Sometimes the very people you raise with all your heart are the ones who turn it cold. And yet, beneath the pain, something else stirred, a memory, a truth I had buried so deeply that even I almost forgot it. My daughter did not know the whole story of her life. She thought she knew who she was, where she came from, but she did not. I had kept her past hidden for decades, locked away in boxes of old letters and documents that sat gathering dust in the back of a closet. I told myself I had done it to protect her, to give her a simple life without the complications of secrets. But now, as her cruelty carved deeper into me, I realized that my silence had also protected her arrogance. As I sat in my quiet corner, I let my tears dry into resolve. She believed I was powerless. She believed she could treat me as if I no longer mattered. But she did not know that the truth I carried had the strength to break her pride. She did not know that her life had been built on a story she had never fully heard. The pain she gave me would not go unanswered, not through anger, not through shouting, but through revelation. One day, she would face the truth I had carried for decades, and it would change everything she thought she knew about herself. For now, I endured in silence. I let her believe I was broken. I let her treat me as invisible. I swallowed the humiliation like I had swallowed hunger years ago, telling myself to wait. The time for truth would come. But in those lonely nights, I held on to the secret like a flame in the darkness, a reminder that even in her rejection, I still held power she could not see. The secret of my daughter's birth was something I thought I would take to the grave. It was a truth I had folded carefully, hidden deep in my heart, buried beneath years of silence and sacrifice. For decades, I carried it like a shadow that followed me everywhere, invisible to everyone else but heavy to me. My daughter believed she knew her story, that she was the child of me and the man she called father. She believed she was the result of a simple marriage, a simple love, a simple family. But she was wrong. Her real beginning was far more complicated, marked by choices I made long before she understood the world. Before I married, I had a relationship with a man whose name carried weight in every corner of our town. He was older, powerful, respected, the kind of man people listened to when he spoke. He was a businessman who had built his wealth through determination, and his influence touched nearly everything around us. To the outside world, he was untouchable. To me, in those days, he was a man who made promises, a man whose attention felt like protection when I was young and vulnerable. When I discovered I was pregnant, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I was scared, unsure of what my future would hold. When I told him, he did not deny his responsibility. He offered support, money, security, even a home if I agreed to keep the truth quiet. But there was one condition: no one could know. His reputation mattered more than anything, and he could not let his world crumble under scandal. I was left with a choice: raise a child alone under shame, or accept his help under silence. In the end, I chose silence. Not for him, but for the child inside me. I thought, if I could give her a stable life, if I could protect her from whispers and shame, it would be worth the burden I carried. Shortly after, I met the man who would become my husband. He was kind, simple, not wealthy or powerful, but he loved me with a steady heart. When I told him about the child, he did not turn away. Instead, he said he would raise her as his own. He gave her his name, his care, his protection. And for that, I was always grateful. To the world, and to her, he was her father. And in many ways, he truly was. But the blood that ran in her veins came from someone else, someone she never even knew was connected to her life. For years, I lived with that secret, locking away the letters the businessman sent, the agreements he signed, the payments he made to ensure my silence. They were tucked into an old box, hidden beneath clothes and papers in the back of a closet. I never looked at them unless I had to, but I never threw them away. Part of me feared what would happen if the truth ever came out, but another part of me kept them as protection. Because I knew life was unpredictable, and secrets have a way of demanding to be revealed when you least expect it. As my daughter grew, I never gave her reason to doubt her place in our family. I treated her father's memory with respect, told her stories of his kindness, let her believe that she came from a union built on love. And in many ways, that was true. He did love her, even if she was not his by blood. But as the years passed, I noticed something in her character, a streak of arrogance, a sharpness that seemed out of place. Perhaps it came from her true father's side, the man who valued power above people. I wondered if the truth of her blood would one day show itself, even if she never knew it. Now, sitting in the house I had sacrificed everything to keep, abandoned by the very child I had given my life to, I realized why I had kept those documents all these years. She believed she held power over me, believed I was helpless, weak, invisible. But she did not know the truth of her own life. She did not know that everything she thought she was built on a lie of silence and sacrifice. And that knowledge, heavy as it was, gave me strength. Because I knew one day, when the time was right, I could pull that truth out of the shadows. And when I did, it would shake her world to its core. The secret of her birth was no longer just a burden I carried. It had become my shield, my weapon, my proof that even in her rejection, I was not powerless. She thought she could erase me with cold words and cruel neglect. But she had no idea that the story of her life was one I had written in silence and one I could rewrite in revelation. The turning point came on a night when my body ached too much to move and my heart ached too much to stay silent any longer. I sat in my room, the walls around me heavy with memories of sacrifice and betrayal, and I realized I could no longer carry the weight of the secret alone. My daughter had wounded me with her words, cut me with her coldness, and abandoned me in my time of weakness. She believed I was powerless, a frail old woman with nothing left to give and nothing left to protect. But she was wrong. Hidden away in the dark corners of this house was proof that her life was not what she believed it to be. Proof that could shatter the arrogance she carried and expose the truth she had ignored all her life. That night, I decided it was time. I walked slowly, my legs weak, my back bent with age, but determination pushed me forward. I opened the old closet, the one I had avoided for years, and pulled out the box buried beneath blankets and forgotten clothes. Dust rose in the air as I set it down, the weight of decades pressing against my chest. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside lay the pieces of a life I had hidden, old letters, photographs, and signed documents, each one carrying a truth I had sealed away. I picked up the letters first, the ones written in the hand of the man who had given my daughter life. His words were formal, businesslike, never tender, but they spoke of responsibility. He acknowledged her existence, promised support, and offered protection as long as silence was kept. I remembered the nights I read them by candlelight, wondering if I had made the right choice. I remembered clutching them in fear whenever rumors spread through town, terrified that the truth would come out before she was ready. Each letter was a piece of the secret I had guarded, proof that her life began differently than she believed. Next, I found the photographs, faded, curled at the edges, but clear enough to show the face of the man whose blood ran in her veins. In some, he stood tall in fine suits, shaking hands with men of influence. In others, he sat beside me, his hand resting on mine, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and calculation. I had hidden these photographs away, never letting her see them, never letting her question why this man's features might resemble her own. But now, as I held them in my hands, I knew they would soon become undeniable evidence of the truth. Finally, I lifted the documents. Legal papers, signed agreements, financial records, all bearing his signature, all confirming what I had known in my heart but hidden from the world. These were not just scraps of paper, they were ironclad proof that the man she had called father was not her blood, proof that her life, her identity, her pride rested on a lie of omission, proof that could bring her to her knees if revealed. As I spread the items across the table, I felt both sorrow and strength. Sorrow, because I had hoped never to use them. I had hoped she would love me enough that the truth would never need to be spoken. Strength, because now I saw that the truth was my last weapon, my final chance to show her that I was not weak, not invisible, not worthless. The turning point was not just about revealing her true father. It was about reclaiming my dignity. It was about showing her that the woman she dismissed as powerless had carried the greatest power all along, the power of truth. For years, I had shielded her from this secret, believing I was protecting her. But now I understood that my silence had given her room to grow arrogant, to treat me with contempt. If she had known the truth, perhaps she would have humbled herself. Perhaps she would have seen me not as a burden, but as the keeper of the story that made her who she was. That night, as I sat staring at the documents, I felt a calmness settle over me. My daughter thought she had the upper hand, thought she could cast me aside without consequence. But I held the truth in my hands, and with it, I would remind her of who I was, of what I had carried, of the sacrifices I had made. I would no longer beg for her care or endure her coldness in silence. The time had come for her to face the truth she had never known. And so, I placed the letters, photographs, and documents back into the box, sealing it carefully. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, she would see. Tomorrow, the story she thought she knew would break open, and the arrogance she carried would collapse under the weight of the truth. The morning of the revelation came quietly, without storm or warning, but in my heart I knew the weight of it would shake everything. I had prepared the night before, laying the box on the table in my room, its contents carefully arranged. The letters, the photographs, the legal documents, all of it, proof of a truth my daughter had never even imagined. I sat there staring at the box for a long time, my old hands trembling as I touched the lid, knowing that once I opened it for her, there would be no turning back. My heart was heavy, but it was steady. She had stripped me of my dignity with her words, abandoned me in my weakness, and humiliated me in my own home. Today, I would return to her not anger, not cruelty, but truth, the truth that would destroy her pride and remind her of who I was. I called her into my room. She entered slowly, her arms crossed, her face already carrying the look of irritation she always wore when I asked for her attention. She expected me to ask for medicine, or food, or some favor she thought was beneath her. She did not expect what was waiting on the table. I gestured for her to sit, and though she sighed heavily, she lowered herself into the chair across from me. Her eyes flickered to the box, curiosity flashing briefly, but she said nothing. With hands that shook but voice that was calm, I opened the box and laid its contents out one by one. First, the letters, yellowed with time but still legible. Then the photographs, their edges curled but the faces clear. Finally, the legal documents, stamped and signed, undeniable in their authority. She watched with growing confusion, her brow furrowing as she realized these were not ordinary scraps of paper. These were pieces of something larger, something hidden. And then I spoke, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "The man you called father," I said, "was not the man who gave you life." Her face went pale instantly, the color draining as though my words had pulled the very blood from her veins. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice breaking between disbelief and fear. But I did not waver. I pushed the letters toward her, let her see the handwriting, the dates, the words written by the man whose blood flowed in her veins. I held up the photographs, showing her the man who had once held my hand, the man whose features she mirrored more than she ever realized. I placed the legal documents in front of her, pointing to the signatures that bound the truth in ink. She stared at them, her eyes darting wildly between the papers and me. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "No, this can't be true." But it was true. I had carried the burden of it for decades, and now it was laid bare before her. Her arrogance crumbled in that moment. The pride she had wielded like a weapon against me shattered under the weight of truth. She looked at me differently now, not as a weak old woman begging for care, but as the keeper of a secret that had defined her very existence. Her hands shook as she touched the papers, her face contorting with confusion, anger, and shame. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. Tears welled in her eyes, though whether they were for herself or for me, I could not tell. I answered calmly, though my heart was heavy. Because I wanted to protect you. Because I wanted you to have a life without the burden of scandal. Because I thought love was more important than truth. I looked at her with tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much neglect and humiliation. But now I see that silence only gave you room to forget who I was, and I will not let you erase me. The room was thick with silence after that. She sat frozen, the truth settling into her bones, her identity crumbling around her. She had thought she knew who she was, thought she stood on a foundation of certainty. But now she realized her entire life had been built on a story I had written to protect her, and that story had just unraveled. For the first time in years, she was speechless, and for the first time in years, I was not the one sitting powerless. The news did not stay inside the walls of that room. Secrets as powerful as this never do. My daughter thought she could hide her shock, thought she could gather herself before others noticed, but the truth spilled out faster than either of us could contain it. The whispers began almost immediately. Family members who once looked at her with respect now looked at her with questions. The man she had always called her father, my husband, was no longer her blood. The businessman, powerful and wealthy, was the one whose veins tied to hers. The revelation tore through the family like a storm. It began with her husband. He found out first, after stumbling upon the papers she had hastily shoved aside but never properly hid. His face turned to stone when he realized the truth, and though he tried to keep calm, the wound to his pride was clear. His family, too, soon heard the whispers. The shame spread like wildfire. A woman who had once stood tall, dismissive of me, proud of her name, suddenly found herself surrounded by doubt and judgment. The world she had built on arrogance and control cracked open. The extended family talked in hushed voices during gatherings. Some avoided her entirely, unwilling to face the scandal. Others confronted her directly, demanding answers, questioning why she had treated her mother so poorly while living a life built on silence and hidden truths. The weight of their eyes on her became unbearable. She who once laughed at my weakness was now the subject of gossip, her pride stripped away in front of everyone she had once tried to impress. I watched it all quietly. For years I had endured her coldness, her dismissive words, her rejection. Now she was the one being rejected, not by me, but by the very people whose approval she craved. Life has a way of balancing itself, and this was the balance she never saw coming. She wanted to escape the shame of caring for her mother, wanted to live free of what she called a burden. But now she carried a shame far heavier, one that followed her wherever she went. Inside the house, her behavior changed. The arrogance that once filled her voice was gone. She moved carefully, quietly, avoiding my eyes as though afraid of what she might see reflected back. She no longer snapped at me, no longer dismissed my words. Instead, she stumbled over apologies, though they were clumsy and insincere. She tried to regain control, to pretend the truth did not matter, but it was too late. The documents, the photographs, the letters, all of it was undeniable. The life she thought she knew had been rewritten in ink long before she was old enough to understand. My daughter began to unravel under the weight of the revelation. Her pride had been her shield, but now it was broken. She struggled to face the world outside, and even inside, she avoided conversation with me, as if speaking to me would only remind her of the truth she could not escape. I had carried the secret for her protection, but when I revealed it, it became her punishment, not by my hand, but by the hand of reality itself. The fallout was not just hers to carry. It touched everyone around her. Her children began to ask questions, confused about the man they called grandfather. Her husband's relatives whispered about bloodlines and inheritance. Even friends she once boasted to avoided her, not wanting to be associated with scandal. Everywhere she turned, the truth followed, and the more she tried to bury it, the more it rose to the surface. like water seeping through cracks. I did not gloat. I did not smile at her pain, but I could not deny the quiet justice of it. She had humiliated me, abandoned me, and treated me as if I had no worth. Yet it was her pride, not mine, that collapsed under the truth. I had lived with the secret for decades, heavy though it was, and I had survived. She, however, could not survive the weight of it for even a few weeks without crumbling. That was the difference between us. I had endured for love, while she had only lived for pride. Now, when she looked at me, I saw not arrogance but fear. Fear of what else I might reveal, fear of what others might still learn, fear of the judgment she could not control. And in that fear, I saw the justice I had been denied for so long. She had thought she was above me, but now she stood humbled, her world cracked wide open by the truth she never expected. After the revelation, life inside the house changed in ways I could never have imagined. The daughter who once looked at me with coldness now avoided my eyes, her pride shattered into pieces too small to gather. She moved differently, quieter, her steps hesitant, as if she was walking on broken glass. The sharp tone she once used on me was gone. In its place was a nervous silence, a forced politeness that felt like a mask she struggled to wear. She thought that by softening her words, by pretending to care, she could mend what was already destroyed. But I had seen her true face, and no amount of false sweetness could erase the memory of her rejection. She began to hover around me more often, bringing me tea, asking if I needed anything, trying to mimic the role of a dutiful daughter. But her actions were not born out of love. They were born out of fear. Fear of what else I might reveal. Fear of losing what little control she still thought she had. Fear of the shame that had already spread like wildfire through our family. I could see it in her eyes. Every smile she forced, every kind word she attempted, was laced with desperation. She was not caring for me out of love. She was caring for me because she realized how much power I still held, even in my old age. But for me, the aftermath was not about her shame. It was about my peace. For the first time in years, I no longer felt powerless. I had spent so long swallowing my pain, believing her coldness defined my worth. But the truth I carried had reminded me of something important. I was never weak. I was never worthless. I had held the key to her life story all along, and when I chose to turn it, her arrogance crumbled. That realization gave me strength. It gave me freedom. The rest of the family treated me differently too. Relatives who once ignored me now came to visit, sitting by my side, asking for stories about the past. They looked at me with respect, with curiosity, with a recognition they had never shown before. I was no longer invisible. The woman they thought was silent and powerless had proven herself as the keeper of truths, the one who had carried history in her hands all these years. Their visits warmed me, not because I wanted their praise, but because I finally felt seen again. My daughter, however, could not escape the weight of the aftermath. Her husband's family kept their distance, embarrassed by the scandal. Friends she once boasted to now looked at her with pity. Even her own children began to ask questions she could not answer without shame. I watched her struggle under the weight of the truth, and though a part of me ached as a mother, another part of me knew this was justice. She had abandoned me in my weakness, and now she lived with the weakness of her own pride collapsing. She tried to repair things between us, but it was too late. Trust, once broken, cannot be stitched back together with shallow words and hollow gestures. I accepted her tea, her polite questions, but my heart remained closed. I no longer sought her love. I no longer begged for her care. I had found strength in the truth, and I had found peace in knowing that justice had been served. The documents, the letters, the photographs, they remained on the table in my room for weeks, a silent reminder of the power I carried. She could not look at them without flinching, and I did not put them away. They were no longer just proof of her birth. They were proof of my dignity, my strength, my worth. Every time I glanced at them, I remembered that I had endured decades of silence, not out of weakness, but out of love. And when love failed, truth became my weapon. The aftermath taught me something I will never forget. Love is a gift, but respect is earned. I had given my daughter endless love, but she had shown me no respect. And so I gave her the truth, not to destroy her, but to remind her that no matter how much she tried to erase me, I would always hold the power of her beginning. She could not take that from me. And as I sat in my room, older and frailer than ever, I realized something even deeper. My story was not about her rejection. It was about my survival. It was about the strength to endure neglect, the courage to reveal the truth, and the justice that came when the secret I carried finally balanced the scales. She thought she had broken me, but in the aftermath, it was clear. I was still standing, and she was the one left shattered. Justice, I learned, does not always roar like thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a whisper that fills every corner of the room until you cannot ignore it. For years, my daughter thought she held the power over me. She thought her coldness could silence me, that her rejection could erase the sacrifices of my life. But in the end, the truth I carried spoke louder than her cruelty. It reminded her, and everyone else, that I was never weak, never invisible. I had endured, I had protected, and I had survived. That, in itself, was justice. When the time came to rewrite my will, I did it without hesitation. I sat with the lawyer, my frail hands steady on the pen, and I removed her name from the inheritance she had always assumed would be hers. I thought of the nights I went hungry so she could eat, the years of work that bent my back, the coins I counted for her future. And then I thought of the words she had thrown at me. "I'm not your caretaker. I have my own life." Those words rang louder than any plea she could now offer. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. My estate, my savings, the home I built, all of it would go to charities, to causes that would actually care for people in ways she never cared for me. Some would go to relatives who had shown kindness, no matter how small. None would go to the daughter who had abandoned me. The day she learned of this decision, her face crumbled in front of me. She begged, pleaded, tried to dress her voice in the softness she had denied me for years. But I saw through it. Her tears were not for me. They were for what she had lost. The wealth, the security, the power she thought she was entitled to. She was not mourning her mother. She was mourning the future she believed was hers by right. That was when I knew that my choice had been the right one. Love cannot be forced, and respect cannot be begged. She had shown me who she was, and now she was living with the consequences. For me, justice was not about revenge. It was about peace. I spent so many years carrying pain in silence, but I refused to let my story end with silence. By revealing the truth of her birth, by rewriting the legacy of my estate, I reclaimed my dignity. I showed her that the woman she dismissed as weak had held strength all along. I showed her that arrogance has a price and neglect has consequences. I showed her that a mother's love may endure, but a mother's justice will not be denied. In my final days, I no longer looked at her with longing or disappointment. I looked at her with clarity. I no longer wished for her care because I had found strength in myself. I no longer begged for her love because I had given myself peace. And when she looked at me, I saw the weight of her choices reflected in her eyes. That was justice, too, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that lingers, that follows you, that reminds you every day of what you lost because of the way you treated someone who once gave you everything. The truth of her real father changed her identity. The rewriting of my will changed her future. And together, they changed the balance of power between us forever. She had abandoned me when I needed her most. But in the end, it was she who was abandoned by the truth, abandoned by the inheritance, abandoned by the love she had carelessly thrown away. As for me, I found peace in knowing that the story of my life would not end in humiliation, but in justice. I left behind not bitterness, but clarity. I left behind not weakness, but strength. I left behind a lesson carved in truth, that no matter how ungrateful someone becomes, no matter how cruel, the sacrifices of a mother do not vanish. They remain, and one day they rise to speak for themselves. And so, my final thought is simple. My daughter refused to care for me. She humiliated me in my weakness, abandoned me in my need. But the truth I carried, the truth of her birth, the truth of her life, became my shield and my justice. In the end, she lost everything, and I gained what I had been denied for so long: peace.